I'm super happy to be here today to talk about a designer's guide to documenting accessibility and user interaction. A little bit about me. I'm a UX researcher and UX designer and live and work in Luxembourg. I'm a Caucasian woman with glasses, yellow and pink hair. And there's some artwork on my slides currently that is an illustration of myself. I'm French and I've been working in the UX industry and in web industry for more than 12 years now. So I started this talk with kind of a sad state of arts. A lot of websites today are sadly still not designed or even developed with accessibility needs in mind. As a designer, a lot of us sadly think that accessibility is the job of the dev team. So accessibility becomes an afterthought. Companies end up launching inaccessible products and websites. And then a team gets asked to fix, air quotes, the accessibility issue later. A little bit like the picture I have on my screen, which is my broken glasses that I tried to duct tape with really pretty, sparkly rainbow duct tape. Of course, it doesn't work. My question is, why fix it when you could design and build it right to start with? This is why we need to bring accessibility awareness earlier in the project. When everyone becomes responsible for the accessibility, most issues can be identified and fixed earlier. And I think that guidelines and documentation can help a lot achieve that. So the first question I want to ask is how and where could we document accessibility and interactions? I'm going to use my project as an example. And to help you a little bit understand what's going on there, here is the structure. So we are using Sketch as a design tool, and we have two different files. On the left on my screen, I have component documentation, which is we have this big Sketch file with all the components where each component is separately described. And then we have page documentation. So in page documentation, we are going to use those components and put together like bigger end pages. And both of those documentation, they end up in Jira tickets. So we are linking to the components, but also to the detailed page in our Jira tickets. And I document a lot of things using annotations. On the left here, I have an example of such annotation at component level. I have a quite complex filter, and I've documented the different states of these filters. And to help my developer team understand how this is supposed to work, I put this kind of small little annotation directly on the mockup components. So I have some little arrows to help people understand where do we click, what happens, things like that. I do this mostly because I've noticed a lot of people don't really like to read super complicated Jira tickets, a lot of specification in the backlogs, and often having this kind of documentation helps them get a pretty quick global understanding of what's going on. I also create some sketch symbols for that so that I don't have to rebuild the little arrow every time. So this is what I have on the left, on the right on my screen. I have arrows, I have little numbers, I have boxes, I have this kind of toolkit that I can just like drag and drop on the page to help me document things. This is at component level. Then sometimes I have annotation at page level. And here I have a full page that is duplicated. At the top, I have the final version of the page. I just like obfuscated some of the more touchy content. And then underneath it, I have the same page, but with a lot of annotation, because again, I need to give instruction to my developers. My advice when creating annotation is make sure your annotation style is different from the page. Here I have magenta stuff. I have like little boxes. I have a specific visual identity for those. And I'm saying that because you want to avoid developers actually implementing the annotation as part of the product. And I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. I've seen this mistake happen before. Like something pink gets implemented because the dev team thought it was part of the product, which was not. So be super careful about that and just like communicate upfront what the annotation looks like versus the design. While searching for this talk and preparing it, I stumbled upon Karen Hawkins' accessibility annotation example, and I kind of really like her format as well. So on the left here, she has the mockup of the page, and on top of this mockup, you have some little blue dots with numbers and some little blue areas. And on the right of the mockup, she has a very detailed design annotation. So regular annotation are in dark, and then she has specific accessibility requirement in red with the prefix AR to make sure that people who are colorblind also have the information. And I really, really like the way she does that because it's quite elegant, and then you have everything in kind of next to each other so you can understand pretty quickly. So that's how I and Karen documents. But if you want to document something for your team, I would say it needs to be useful. And for that, I would say ask your own team how they would prefer you to document as a designer. There can be many different things. Like some people prefer super detailed Jira tickets. Some people want a super detailed Confluence documentation, maybe a Word document, some mockups annotation. In Figma, for instance, you can put a lot of comments directly on the screen, so you don't even need to export those things like that. For me, it's all about what's the best format for your team. And this has to be an open discussion if you want your documentation to be used. And again, remember, documentation is not a substitute for communication. It's not a substitute for talking to people. So it's still important to present the documentation, the mockup in person to the people. So in our team, we have this weekly meeting, and during those meetings, the developer will show some demos of what was developed, and then I will also show what's being currently designed. And we have this kind of alignment session where they can challenge me, they can ask questions and things like that. So I've shared the how and where I document. Let's dig into kind of further actual example. What exactly can or should designer document when it comes to accessibility and interactions? To help us process this talk, I've split this into 4 different categories. I have visual design, interaction, wayfinding, and enhanced content and markup. Let's start with visual design documentation. Often when we talk about accessibility to designers, the first thing that comes to mind is color palettes. It's like making sure our color palette is accessible. So what I used to do a little bit when I had like less colors and less complex projects, I would document the color palette. So here I have a blue, purple, and a lot of different shades of gray color palettes. And for each and one of those, I had them match with a background, a white background or white text. So I documented if this color, like can you use this blue with a white background or white text? Does this work with the AA or AAA criteria? But here I'm only comparing it to white or light background or dark background. Sometimes I need a little bit more. And when I need a little bit more, I can build a color matrix. So don't worry, all the links to those tools are into my presentation, and I also have a blog post with all the links. So if you're interested into that kind of tool, you will have access to it at the end of the talk. So here I have this kind of color matrix where I have the same colors on the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. And at the intersection of both of those, you have the color ratio if you pair those together. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to know if I can use this dark purple and if I can use it with yellow. So if I'm at the intersection of the dark purple and yellow, I have a 6.9 contrast ratio, which is pretty good. So for AA criteria. But if I wanted to pair this dark purple with my light purple, this wouldn't work. 1.6 color ratio is not enough. So at the beginning, it might sound a little bit overwhelming, but once you understand that you have to check for the intersection, it's a pretty useful tool for designers and everyone in the team to know if they can use the 2 colors together. And one important thing is still not all designers are familiar with those kind of things like color ratio, AA, AA, AAA. So if you have documentation, also put some examples and explain everything that is supposed to work, the acronyms and things like that. So I have a really interesting example, and here again you have the link where you have WCAG for designers that explains a little bit all of that for people like me who might not be super familiar with that. The next category is interaction. So for interactive component, let's say buttons, the first thing I usually try to document is the states. In my example here, I have a button that has a default state, the hover state, a focus state, an active state, and in case I need that, a disabled state for different kind of sizes and variation of the same button. Focus state is particularly important for accessibility because this is the state that will be triggered when someone will use keyboard navigation. So if you are going to change the default focus of the browser, you need to document that as well. For checkboxes or radio button, I have more states. I have default focus checked, disabled, disabled checked, and then we have stuff that doesn't exist in HTML per se, but we need it because we have complex table, which is indeterminate, and disabled indeterminate. Same for radio button. And all of that is my documentation for interactions at component level. For form input, you can also have the kind of classic states. Default focus, field read-only. Sometimes people like to have a hover state for form elements as well. But then someone might interact with us, and then you might need some extra statuses like error, success, information. And for those, my advice is don't just use color. Make sure you have a second way to indicate what's going on in here. So here I have kind of three ways. I have the border color, I have the color of the text, and I have a message with a small icon. And all combined together are my different statuses. And then at page level, when this component is used, I'm not just giving like generic examples, but I'm going really into the actual example law. So when do we trigger the error case? Here I have a form that is supposed to be a way to check for signature years from to, and user can only enter years. So the error here is triggered if users enter something that is not a year with 4 digits, and if users enters letters in this field. So that's my error case. And then I also put the exact message. So here, if you're working with content writer or UX writers, maybe they can also help with how to write a proper error message. For complex components, if I have a lot of interactions, I build an interaction flow. So this is a little bit more complex, but here I have an example of a component that is a filter. You click on a button and it will open a list of checkboxes, and you can check and uncheck. For instance, if you want to remove some columns from a table, something like that. So here what I start by documenting is mouse interaction. I document step by step what happens when a user opens the filter, hovers an element, checks one of the boxes, hits the apply button, things like that. And then on top of the mouse interaction, I duplicate that with some keyboard interaction. So I end up at the bottom here with something quite similar. That is my keyboard navigation of these components. How to open the component, enter, space. How to close it, escape. How to navigate across the different elements, use the up and down key. How to check a box, etc., etc. And if you have some keyboard shortcuts, like I don't have any in my tool, but for instance, if you're building tools like Figma, which is a design tool in the browser, you have a lot of keyboard shortcuts. Those kind of things can also be documented here as well. Providing alternatives for complex gesture is also an accessibility requirement and a usability best practice. If you take Gmail, Android app, for instance, you can swipe right to archive an email directly. This is considered as a complex gesture. So if I were to document something like that for Gmail, I would document two alternatives. I would document the fact that you can long press directly on the email, and then it shows the little toolbar at the top, and you need a second press, but a press is not a complex gesture, and then you can archive that. Or you can open the email and then press the archive button that is always at the top. So for complex gesture, always make sure to provide an alternative and then document that alternative if needed. For complex responsive page, you could also document the zoom behavior, which is what happens when the user zooms in at 200%, 300%, things like that. I'll be honest, with responsive web design, usually we have responsive guidelines, so I will often not go into that detail of documentation for website. But for native application, I think it's quite interesting. So this is an example I borrowed from Goulven Baron at Maïf, and he documented on the left the behavior of this native application at 100% zoom level, and then how it's supposed to behave at 200% zoom level, like how do the buttons scale, how does the text scale, things like that. One aspect of design that's quite tricky to document, I'll be honest, is animations and transitions. There are also some accessibility guidelines and best practices for those. Some animations and transition might trigger motion sickness to some users with vestibular disorders. I'm one of those users. And to avoid that, you can use something in CSS called prefers reduced motion media query to provide an alternative version for people who prefer less motion. So on my website, I have my face, and I have like 3 little things that float around my face, which is the default animation. And then when you scroll down, I'm scrolling down and I have plants growing up, which could be triggering for some people because you have 2 things moving at 2 different paths and tastes. So now if I test the motion sickness version, the prefers reduced motion, I completely remove the animation of the floating things. And then for the little plant, instead of having it grow up, I just have this smooth and sleek little fade-in animation that is supposed to be less triggering than actually the plant growing. So this is a little bit tricky because animation is something that you usually have to build directly in the browser. So this, I think, is where you need a big collaboration with your developer team. It's like, how do you document animation? Honestly, complicated. You could use storyboards, for instance, but you still like drawing something static or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I would say for animation and prefers reduced motion, discuss directly with the developer team and test it with actual users. And then also, don't forget, if you have content that is moving around and playing automatically on your interface, users need to have a way to stop that. So like videos on sliders, things like that. So in your design, you need to have this kind of play pause button as well. One last level of documentation when it comes to interaction is interaction across pages or across views if you are in a native application. User flow on the left of my screen are kind of a step-by-step box and arrow graph to document how someone will accomplish a task. We list pages, view, branches, if there's like some choices to be made. They're usually built at the beginning of the project. So this is usually how we are going to plan all our pages, things like that. And then screen flows on the right of my page. They are kind of the same, but instead of having abstract little boxes and arrows, I will put the actual detailed screen and mockup once we have finished the design. So both of those design artifacts or UX artifacts help developer team and tester understand how a user is supposed to navigate across the whole interface from page to page. And such thing also helps usually plan some aspects of accessibility, like transition between pages. If you want to animate those, this helps you like know where your transition are going to be. Again, be careful with motion sickness. Alerts, if you do an action on one page and it triggers an alert and you need to keep that alert at the top of the page on the next page, things like that. This is the kind of things you need to be careful with accessibility. Also, if you have those super complex form with multiple steps and session length, usually you want to avoid session length. You want to let people all the time in the world if they want to fill in a form, but sometimes for some technical or security reason, you have session length on those forms. And if you have a multiple step process, it becomes a nightmare. So seeing kind of those step-by-step thing helps you plan accordingly. The next category is wayfinding. Wayfinding is the documentation of the things that will help people find their way on the page, navigation, stuff like that. So let's start with HTML page title, which is something that gets often forgotten because we don't really see it on the page. You only see it in the browser tab, but page title is really important for screen reader users. It gets announced. It's the first thing the screen reader is going to announce. And it helps users know where they are on the page. And if you write good HTML title, it should help them understand what's expected on this page. For those, you can kind of document them directly on the page. We have Jira Etiquette because we have a complex enterprise tool, and our page title, they not just like pages, like specific static pages. We have like dynamic pages. So we are basically documenting the structure of the page title for those. Designers, they can also document the skip to content links. So the skip to content link is a link that is often invisible, but not always, by default. And when the user starts navigating with keyboard navigation, it shows. It's also announced by the screen reader, and it lets the people skip directly to different parts of the page. Usually, they want to skip to the main content. So this way, if they know the navigation and they don't care about it and they want to go directly to the content, they can do it pretty quickly. So what you want to document for the skip to content link, where is the link? Is it visible by default or not? So here in my example, I have a cooking recipe website. It's not visible by default. It's visible when the user focuses, and then it sends the user to the main content, which is the core of the page with the name of the cooking recipe. So my skip content is sending my user to something that is called an area landmark, which is and we have a lot of them in HTML. So area landmark is a specific way to identify different parts of a website. This can also be documented with the help of accessibility experts because it's kind of a little bit more code than design. But here I have a fun example because it's the area landmark documentation with the area landmark annotated directly on top of it, kind of Inception, I would guess. So those kind of areas and landmark, they're super useful to screen reader users because then they can get a sense of the page structure directly and they can navigate to different parts. So this is something you can also document. Then once the user is inside the content of the page, you need proper HTML heading. H1, H2, H3, make sure you have that. And here again, this can be documented. So I usually have two ways to document that. First, I always put the heading name in my style. So here on the right, it's in Figma, I have H1, S is for small center, H1, S left, H2 left, things like that. So that whenever other designers are going to reuse the style, they know exactly what heading level this corresponds to. I can also put an extra documentation, which is I'll have these little arrows where I can put some text. And here I have put the H1 documentation. So this is a mobile version of my cooking recipe website. H1 is at the top. It's the title of the recipe, gluten-free pizza. Then I have ingredients as H2, preparation step as H2, and then each step is an H3. Some people will also navigate without a mouse, and they will navigate using keyboard navigation, especially the tab key. So in this case, the focus order of the page should follow the logical flow of the page. So this is something you can also document. Here I have an example from a Figma template by Fluent Design System, which is a team at Microsoft, and they provide this Figma template toolkit to help you with annotation. Again, links in the slides. You have the mockup in the background, and then it's the same annotation technique where you have some little dots directly with numbers on the page and some little area. And this is to show how the focus navigation is supposed to work. So user is going to go through the top of the page first, the one in green, blue. Then there's a second section of the page with a few information. They're going to go left to right. Then they will enter the navigation on the left. And 14th is the back to something else before entering the actual content of the page. So you might not need to kind of document this for simple pages, but if you start playing around with super complex business application, dashboard, things like that, with a lot of links, button interaction, you might need something like that to make sure that the focus order actually makes sense, so that someone can navigate the whole website just with keyboard navigation without using a mouse. Then another example is on form elements. Here I have 2 column form elements. And again, I'm documenting this using the annotation technique. If you're using Figma, there's a plugin by the team at Microsoft that is called Accessibility Focus Order that will help you to do exactly that, will help you put the little dots on the little areas. And then here for my form, I want the user to go from left to right. I want them to go through all the fields on the left and then on the right side. So who are you? What is your request about? Email address, your message, and then send the email. The last category is contents and markup. The first thing that usually comes to mind with content or markup is images and icon, and how should this be documented? So if you have images and icon, you usually want to try to document what should assistive technology announce or not announce in my case. Here I have still my example of a cooking recipe website. This is a cooking, a detail page. So what I have is an annotation on the big slice of pizza image, and I have documented on the right using the annotation technique what exactly this alternative text is supposed to say. Then next to my big image, I have 3 buttons. I have save, share, and rate, and each one of those has a small little icon. The thing here is that I've already have the text. I have save, share, and rate written in plain HTML, which means that here, screen reader should not announce anything for those images. Otherwise, it would be super annoying for people to hear the icon and then the text. So this is what I'm saying. You need to document what the technology needs to announce, and sometimes it might be do not announce anything. And here in my example, I'm kind of imagining I'm coding this website by hand. In real life, of course, often for cooking recipe websites, you will be using a content management system, which means that someone has to provide these alternative texts, usually authors or end users. So it also means that a developer has to develop a field that will contain the alternative text. So this is something you need to be aware of as well. This is the sort of thing that also need to be documented. If you're building a website that has a content management system and you need to enter such things, at some point, you need to provide a way for authors to provide these kind of things. And if you're interested into all of those sort of things like accessibility for CMS and WYSIWYG tools, there's something called ATAG, Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, and you could look into that. Again, link in the slide. So in my second example here, I have kind of a little tile, and I have table in that tile, and I can switch this from the table view to the graph view. Here I have 2 buttons, but those buttons, they do not have a label. So in this case, I actually need an alternative text. So here it would be view graph or view table, depending on which button is selected. I can also document the announced content order. So this is interesting if the visual order is a little bit different from the HTML flow. Please note that most of the time you want this to be the same. You want your HTML flow to be the same as the visual order, so be really, really careful with that. But here I have a very specific example where in order to gain some space, I stacked some content on top of each other. So I have kind of a little card, because this is kind of card design, it's quite trendy at the moment. So it's still my cooking recipe website example. I have a card. In this card, I have an image of the recipe, and I have a save button, but in order to gain space, I've put it on top of the image. So what I want for the save button, I want it to be at the bottom of the HTML. I want this to be the last thing announced by the screen reader, but visually I put it on the top. So this is kind of the kind of trickery I sometimes have to do, mostly here because it's either a mobile version of the component or because it's going to be used in a kind of masonry grid. But here what I documented is basically, I don't want anything announced for the image because I assume it's going to be displayed with a lot of other cooking recipe websites for a lot of other cooking pizza recipe, and it might be annoying to have the screen reader say slices of pizza every 2 seconds. So no alternative image for the slice of pizza. I want the title to be announced first because it's big and the visual hierarchy conveyed here is something that is showing that this should be announced first, then categories, summary, and then the save button last. So I could have put the categories under the big title. This is again kind of a design choice. So this is fun, but again, be super careful with that and talk to your developer before starting to mess around with the content order versus visual order of your components. Then if you have something clickable, sometimes what is clickable is not obvious. Here I have an example with another card, and in my card I have 4 links. Each link has a little icon, a title, a number, and an arrow. And my developer may ask, okay, but where do I put the link? Do I put it on the title, on the icon, on the little arrow? The answer is the whole thing. The whole element is clickable. But this is again something that needs to be documented at some point. And then sometimes screen reader users might need some extra information because your design is okay and conveys something by stacking elements that might not be reflected. For instance, if you have some notification, so you have those little bubbles on top of an icon that says you have 2 new documents or you have 3 new tasks. For someone who sees the screen, it can be kind of obvious that the little bubble is a notification. But for a screen reader, what happens if this gets announced? It might just announce the number. So to improve that, what we can do is to have kind of an extra layer for the assistive technology saying something like no new documents or 5 new documents in my documents, no new tasks in my tasks, 5 new tasks in my tasks, depending on the situation. And with the help of developers and accessibility experts, there's a lot of things you can actually document with markup. You could document the correct semantic of elements. Do we use a link or a button? Area roles, area states and property, the landmark I talked about a little bit before. So for example, when it comes to form, things I tend to do because I kind of know a little bit of HTML is documenting the correct HTML type. So here I have an example of a select box where I'm saying, well, I'm not going to recreate a select, we're using the HTML select element. I have data rich picker where I'm saying we are going to use input type dates. I have a filter with a search, and I'm saying we are going to use input type search. You can document things like autocomplete, autofill, if you need some invisible labels, because sometimes you have this search and it doesn't say, you don't put the label on the screen because it's a big search in the middle of the screen, but the screen reader still needs to have an invisible label at some point, things like that. And then you might have things you can't document directly in the mockups, and for those you could use external links. I'm thinking about audio transcripts. If you're doing a podcast, for instance, you could put a link to the audio transcript, which is a text version of your podcast. Or if you're doing some videos, you could put a link to the plain text transcript or to the SRT file for captioning, things like that. So there's still a lot of things that are more like content related that I can't really put into the mockup because it's kind of a more complex document. And for those, we're using kind of a Excel sheet with all the links. So I talked about how to document and gave you a lot of examples. Then usually at this point, the question is, who should document accessibility? I showed you what designers can document, but then should someone else document something? And I would say I have 2 answers for you. It depends, because I love the it depends answer because I'm a UX designer and it's a team effort. Designers, they can document a lot of things. They can document how it works, how it looks like, how to navigate, and everything I just talked to you about. Developers, accessibility experts, they can document the correct markup. They can document ARIA role. They can document landmarks. They can go deeper into the documentation of the code or how it's supposed to be implemented. Then you have content or UX writer, SEO people. Those people can help too. They can help provide alternative tags. They can provide help call to action that makes sense instead of the click here shitty CTA that you see everywhere. So you can partner up with those people if you want to have content that make more sense and better copy, which is also pretty important for accessibility. And then you have QA team, so quality assurance and testing team. And they will have to test the stuff. So at some point, they will usually document how to test the components, how to test the accessibility of the components, what are the test cases, things like that. So my advice here is start with what you and your team are comfortable with documenting and then build upon that basis. While preparing this talk, I try to kind of organize what I feel comfortable documenting on my own, what I need the help of the developers or accessibility experts to document, and what we would like to work on with content writers and SEO. And I built this kind of three quadrant matrix where I put everything I just talked to you about in this conference in a different area there. And this is a very personal way of ordering things, and it's based on my own area of expertise. But I would advise you to do such an exercise with your own team. Like the mapping will obviously be different because it depends on a lot of things, but having your team map what they feel comfortable with documenting and what they need help with could also be a good idea. And mapping who should document those things. Finally, one question I get a lot is, when do I have time to document all of this? And usually I don't document wireframes. I document final and tested components or pages after I had a discussion with the developers team about can we technically do that? Which means that before documenting some of those, I might rework the component until it's technically doable, feasible, buildable. And then I create the final documentation. So I gave you plenty of examples of what to document. The final question is, how do I convince my team? Like, why should we invest time in such things? Like, what are the benefits of such documentation? Well, there's a lot of benefits for myself as a designer first. I need to learn about accessibility in order to be able to talk about it and to be able to document it. So I learned actually a lot of things while building this conference as well. Documenting helped me keep up to date and understand the different accessibility needs. It also forces me to think about interaction beyond the kind of static pixel mockup and drawing in Sketch or Figma. Like documenting such things is a nice mental effort that forces me to take a step back and ask myself, okay, how will someone interact with that with a mouse, with a keyboard, with a touch screen? What will a screen reader say? Do we need extra information or not? Is this clear? And sometimes I'm so deep into details that I might start designing something, and then after thinking about interaction, I will notice like, okay, no, this simply cannot work. It looks pretty, but it doesn't work. So this kind of documentation also kind of forces me to rethink some of the solution to make sure that they will actually work once someone will interact with it. There are also benefits for the design-developer relationship and collaboration. So design documentation helps avoid some misinterpretation and gain time. Of course, documentation doesn't mean you don't talk to your developers. You still need to present the mockups, but sometimes there might be months between the moment we discussed the components, I presented it to them, I built the documentation, and the moment that Jira tickets arise on their backlog. And having this kind of base documentation also helps remember and restart the conversation. And again, for the QA team, it helps them know how to test the documents, the components. It brings consistency to the future pages and interactions. Sometimes I will build something and then my developer will ask me like, Steph, this is almost the same component and this one. Shouldn't it work the same way? And I'm like, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. So it helps kind of have this double check once your design system grows and make sure it's consistent. And then it benefits my fellow designers. It's a good onboarding tool for new members in the team, especially if they don't know anything about accessibility. They get examples of how it works, how it's expected, what is expected from them, and then they will often ask a lot of questions and learn about accessibility while reading the documentation and creating some. Prior documentation also helps set standards as to what is expected for the next design. So this is kind of, again, this idea of bringing consistency, but not just towards the components, but also when the team is growing to make sure that everyone is on the same page and that a new designer who comes to the team does not forget about accessibility. And then in the end, it benefits everyone. So it starts a conversation about accessibility within the company, and then it encourages people to dig a little bit further. So it helps make sure that accessibility is not an afterthought anymore, and it's part of the process at each and every single stage. So I shared a lot of things with you of what you can document as a designers. The goal was to give you some example, but I'll be honest, I don't always have time to document all of that in every single one of my workups and components. So I would say if time is limited, pick your battle. Document the things where there might be the biggest issue of understanding. Also document kind of high stake, the things that are super complex components that will be reused. So it's about prioritization. The important thing is that it's a teamwork. So even if you can't document everything at some point, keep a channel of communication open with your developer team, because they might also know about accessibility and be able to do something about that. Also communicate with other designers and with the tester, so that together we can push accessibility forward and make sure it's kind of taking into account from the start of the project and not just at the end. And yes, it's a big demanding journey, but it's worth it. Thanks for your attention. And the rest of the slides, it's just resources. So this conference exists as an article. I also built an accessibility and interaction checklist based on the conference to help you with documentation. I put together a list of different Figma templates and sketch templates, like annotation templates. And I have a lot of different links on the blog.
That was just a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions that came in. We've got a few minutes to maybe address some of those, and you're welcome to jump on any of these questions that have come in along the way. But there were a couple that were about the time requirements for this. One question was, on average, based on your experience, how much time should be additionally budgeted for creating detailed, accessible documentation and development guided by the documentation? And along with that, I received another question that related. Says, how do you address concerns from designers about this level of detail in design being too much, or maybe being more appropriate during the actual implementation?
Yeah, so the time is a little bit hard to estimate, because it depends. Is this already part of what you do? Like, do you already document a lot of things? I was talking about documenting accessibility and interactions. So if you take my example with the button, I would say it's a given. You need to document all of the states. Otherwise, what will happen is your developer will ask you. So all the time that you think you are going to gain by not documenting things will be a lot of back and forth with the developer team. And if not, it will be the developer who will have to design that. So at some point, it's like, if you want to cut corners on that kind of stuff, then it will have impacts later on the project. So I can't really give you kind of a number, but for me, honestly, since I'm already documenting a lot of interactions, the accessibility part, I don't know, it's like 5 or 10% more of time, like of my documentation time. So it's kind of not that much, because we do by default a lot of those things already. So I would say one of the arguments is to say, yeah, but if your designers don't document things, at some point, someone will have to decide how it's supposed to work. So if no one is saying, yeah, this is how this component is supposed to happen. When you click that, it should do that. When you press enter, it should do that, and that. Then yeah, this will fall on the kind of arms or shoulders of your dev team. So if you think that by shortcutting the design time, you gain time, I would say no, it's even worse. I had this kind of, there's a well-known agile curve where you see how much more does it cost to change a design based on the different cycles. And like, if you change the design at the beginning, it costs almost nothing because it's a design. If you have to change or decide things once development started or once development is finished, it's going to cost a lot of money. So I would say that's I think the biggest argument in favor of documentation is at some point, it's not that much about documentation, it's about communication. You can maybe not document that, but if you don't document it, you need to have some time later in the project to talk to the developers about what do you expect. So if you prefer to have a lot of meetings and explain whatever you want to explain, then it's fine. But it will be still time that you need to invest at some point.
Great. Thank you. I found the answer to most important accessibility questions is it depends. And that's very much related to that. And that communication and these relationships across teams. There was a question, don't you have bad reactions from devs when you tell them their code should use things like a link versus a button? Don't they tell you it is my role to be making those decisions? And I would maybe counter that question or add to it from the other side that sometimes we hear developers say, if it's not documented, I'm not building it that way. And so there's a little bit of a tension. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's again about role responsibilities and communication. Like, I'm sorry, I don't want to trash developers, but I've worked in places where I had to fight to get a label with name and like to make sure that you have the label that goes with the input. As I was like, I had more HTML knowledge than the front-end developers I was working with. So at some point, this is why I did this matrix. And this is also why I kind of encourage you. Like at the beginning of the project, maybe you have amazing developers who know a lot about accessibility, and then it can be a discussion. Like if they know if a button or a link is or a link is better, then you don't need to go into that level of documentation, But if they don't, then maybe you could discuss it together, things like that. So for now, I never really had any issue with with developers because I'm not telling them what exact HTML element I want. Most of the time, I'm like suggesting, or I'm like, yeah, I want this to work like that, and then we can check together, So this is why it's again about communication. Maybe some things you don't document in the design. Maybe you put that in Jira or whatever documentation tool you use at some point, Confluence, or we used to have, I forgot the name of the other one. No, never mind. But yeah, there was another one where you could put this kind of things. So yeah, I'm lucky enough. I never had any kind of conflicts. For now, it's more like collaboration. But yeah, I can see how it might arise. And yeah, usually conflicts means role and responsibility issues. So you put that on the table at the beginning of the project and you discuss like adult human being working together.
Yeah, that's awesome. There was actually a comment very early in your presentation in chat. Somebody said developers sometimes think accessibility is someone else's job as well. So it's a team culture change. And yeah. I think your presentation really demonstrated that when accessibility is considered throughout that process, especially early in that design and with annotations, that it just becomes part of that design development culture. I don't know, maybe you could speak to that and maybe how you've a little bit more on how maybe design has influenced your overall culture of accessibility.
I think it's the other way around, to be honest.
Oh, great.
Accessibility has influenced a lot the way I design, which is, yeah, kind of maybe a little bit weird because designers are not often taught about accessibility. If we're lucky, we get the basics, which is color, and that's basically it. But yeah, I was lucky enough to work with a company who gave accessibility trainings, and then I was able to dig through internet resources, conferences, meeting amazing people around the topic. So it's kind of the other way around. Like today, I think it would be weird for me to design something if I didn't double check the contrast ratio up front. So yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. There's a lot of questions that have come in. Oh, one quick item of business. There were some comments about the video quality for the presentation. Zoom really downgraded that video. In the chat, Stephanie shared the links to the slides and other resources that are there. In the archives, we will provide the higher quality video in the archive video. So if you're watching that, you can get that down below in those resources down in the video description below. So we'll make sure that you have access to those. So apologies for the video quality. Maybe one last quick question. Are you using the design system built along with the dev team? I think that could be a component that would really support the accessibility, not only in design and annotation, when the components are built, if accessibility is part of that design system. Yeah.
So I can't really show it to you because the design on my arm on my computer, but the actual design system is on my client's computer, which is security airtight. But what you have is like, I explained a little bit at the beginning. I have design system files in Sketch, which is a library. And then I reuse all of those components directly into the pages. And we have the exact same thing on the development side. We have Git Sandbox. So basically my developer recreated Storybook. For those who are familiar, Storybook is kind of a sandbox where you can put all your components and then you can test it, you can play around with them. So we have this kind of super big library in a tool that we build ourselves. And yeah, indeed, what we do is we try to bake accessibility inside a component. So we had a discussion last time where I don't know why something wasn't specified properly. And no, I think they completely forgot about keyboard accessibility of one of those drop down menu. And I was like, look, this thing is used I don't know how many times around all the interface. So the really cool thing is once my developer added keyboard navigation to that one component, then all the components that we were using were all of a sudden had the keyboard navigation, which was amazing. So yeah, definitely we are building a design system and we are trying to bake in accessibility in some of those components when it's kind of, this is the easy way, because like you have a drop down, it's kind of easy to have the keyboard interaction. It's a little bit more complicated to bake it at component level when you have like a big page with a lot of links and all of that. But yeah, we're trying to really bring that. I don't know if we have legal obligation. It's kind of a blurry area. I try to get some information, but even the people in the enabled team, which is the team dealing with disabilities and accessibility at work, they're more focused on like physical accessibility, building stuff like that. So they're kind of a little bit lost on the digital one. So we're like, you know what? Well, let's make it as accessible as possible then for the digital version and see if we can do something.